So Doug Ford just gave Mark Carney a tour of Ontario wine country, and before you ask, no, I didn't misspell that. We're talking about an actual vineyard tour, complete with grapes and presumably some very expensive bottles of Chardonnay. But stick around, because the real wine we're talking about isn't the kind you drink. It's the kind that pours out of Queen's Park every time someone mentions the federal government. Welcome to the most passive-aggressive political field trip in Canadian history, and trust me, it's juicier than a Niagara Peninsula ice wine. Let me set the scene for you. Mark Carney, former Bank of Canada governor, former Bank of England governor, and current frontrunner to potentially lead the Liberal Party and become Prime Minister, decides to take a little trip to Ontario. Probably thinking he'll do some glad-handing, meet some constituents, show he's a man of the people. Standard political stuff, right? Well, Doug Ford had other plans. Ford, Ontario's premier and the human embodiment of a Tim Hortons breakfast sandwich, decides to personally escort Carney through Ontario's wine region. And if you think this was just a friendly gesture between two guys who appreciate a good Riesling, I have a bridge in Toronto to sell you. Actually, scratch that. Ford would probably toll that bridge first. This wasn't just a tour. This was a masterclass in political theater disguised as hospitality. Ford rolled out the provincial red carpet, showed Carney around the vineyards, probably pointed out all the beautiful scenery, and then casually mentioned every single grievance Ontario has with the federal government. It's like inviting someone over for dinner and spending the entire evening subtly reminding them about that $20 they owe you from 2019. Except instead of $20, we're talking billions in healthcare transfers and infrastructure funding. The beauty of this whole situation is how perfectly it captures the current state of federal-provincial relations in Canada. We've got premiers who are so fed up with Ottawa that they're now using wine tours as diplomatic negotiations. Forget formal meetings and sterile government offices. Nope, we're doing politics between the Pinot Noir and the Cabernet Sauvignon now. It's very Canadian, actually. We're too polite to have an outright screaming match, so instead, we'll passive-aggressively show you our wine and make pointed comments about federal funding. But let's talk about why Ford even bothered with this elaborate production. Mark Carney isn't just some random tourist. This guy could very well be the next Prime Minister of Canada. He's got the credentials, the international experience, the name recognition, and apparently the backing of enough Liberal insiders to make him a serious contender whenever Trudeau finally decides to ride off into the sunset. So Ford sees an opportunity. He's thinking, if this guy might be running the show in Ottawa soon, maybe it's time to start buttering him up now. Or in this case, winding him up. Ford has never been shy about his issues with the federal government. Healthcare funding, carbon taxes, immigration policy, infrastructure money. The list goes on longer than a Canadian winter. And he's been vocal, sometimes loudly so, about how he feels Ontario gets the short end of the stick in Confederation. So what better way to make your point than to show a potential future Prime Minister exactly what he'd be governing? Walk him through the vineyards, let him see the economic potential, the jobs, the tourism dollars, and then casually mention how much better it could all be if Ottawa would just open up the wallet a bit more. It's actually kind of brilliant when you think about it. Ford is playing the long game here. He knows that formal complaints and strongly worded letters to the Prime Minister's office often go nowhere. They get filed away, acknowledged with bland political speak, and then promptly ignored. But a personal tour? That sticks. You can't ignore someone when they're standing right next to you, pointing at grapevines and talking about healthcare wait times. It's relationship building with a side of political pressure, all wrapped up in the veneer of Ontario hospitality. And Carney, to his credit, probably knew exactly what he was walking into. The man spent years navigating international finance and central banking politics. He's not naive. He knows when he's being lobbied. But here's the thing about being a politician or potential politician, you can't really say no to these kinds of invitations. What's he going to do? Refuse a tour of one of Ontario's key economic sectors? That would look terrible. So he goes along, smiles for the cameras, tastes the wine, and takes mental notes about every single complaint Ford is embedding in the conversation like landmines in a very expensive vineyard. Now let's talk about the optics of this whole situation, because they're absolutely delicious. You've got Ford, the populist premier who brands himself as a man of the people, showing around Carney, the elite economist who's literally run the banks of two countries. It's like watching a political buddy comedy where the two leads have absolutely nothing in common except a mutual interest in not looking bad on camera. Ford probably ordered a beer while Carney swirled wine and talked about notes of oak and berries. The contrast writes itself. But beneath the surface of this wine-soaked political theater, there's actually a serious conversation happening about the future of Canadian federalism. Because what Ford is really doing here is testing Carney. He's figuring out whether this potential future Prime Minister is going to be more receptive to provincial concerns than the current government. He's establishing a relationship, setting expectations, and making it very clear that if Carney wants Ontario's support or cooperation, there are going to be some negotiations involved. The wine country location itself is significant too. Ford didn't take Carney to a manufacturing plant or a tech hub, though Ontario has plenty of both. He took him to wine country because it represents something specific, economic success that's vulnerable to policy decisions. Wine production in Ontario depends on agriculture policies, trade agreements, environmental regulations, and tourism infrastructure. All things that involve both federal and provincial jurisdiction. It's a visual representation of how interconnected governance actually is, and how federal decisions can make or break industries at the provincial level. And let's be honest, there's probably a bit of showing off involved too. Ontario's wine industry has grown significantly over the past few decades. It's a legitimate success story of regional economic development. Ford gets to point at something and say, look what we built here in Ontario. It's provincial pride mixed with a subtle dig at federal policy. Like, see what we can accomplish when Ottawa doesn't get in our way. It's impressive and accusatory at the same time, which is a very Doug Ford way of doing things. The timing of this tour is also worth noting. We're in a period of massive political uncertainty in Canada. Trudeau's popularity is in the basement, the Liberals are facing potential electoral disaster, and everyone's jockeying for position in what could be a major political realignment. Ford has his own ambitions, whether that's maintaining power in Ontario or potentially playing kingmaker at the federal level. Carney is positioning himself as a potential savior for the Liberal Party. These two are circling each other like prize fighters, except instead of a boxing ring, they're in a vineyard, and instead of throwing punches, they're making small talk about terroir. What makes this whole situation so perfectly Canadian is that it's conflict wrapped in politeness. In other countries, you might have premiers openly defying the federal government or threatening to withhold cooperation. In Canada, we take potential prime ministers on wine tours and express our grievances over glasses of locally produced Vidal. We're mad, but we're going to be civilized about it, damn it. We'll show you our nice things, feed you well, and then politely but firmly explain everything you're doing wrong. It's aggressive, but in the most aggressively Canadian way possible. Ford has also been known to use these kinds of stunts to great effect. He understands media and messaging better than a lot of politicians give him credit for. A wine tour generates better coverage than a press conference. It gets picked up by lifestyle sections, food and drink publications, tourism media, not just political reporters. It's a way of controlling the narrative and getting his message out to a broader audience. Plus, the visuals are way better. Nobody wants to watch two guys in suits sitting at a conference table. But two guys walking through a beautiful vineyard with fall colors in the background? That's content gold. The real question is whether any of this actually matters. Will a wine tour change federal policy? Will it make Carney more sympathetic to provincial concerns if he becomes Prime Minister? Hard to say. Politics is about relationships as much as policy, and relationships are built through exactly these kinds of interactions. Ford is banking on the idea that FaceTime matters, that personal connections influence decisions, and that showing someone your province's strengths and challenges is more effective than sending another bureaucratic letter to Ottawa. But there's also a risk here for both of them. For Ford, cozying up to a potential Liberal Prime Minister could anger his Conservative base, who want him to fight Ottawa, not wine and dine potential Ottawa leadership. For Carney, being seen as too chummy with provincial premiers, especially Conservative ones, could complicate his positioning within the Liberal Party or with progressive voters. It's a delicate dance, performed in a vineyard, with cameras rolling and everyone pretending this is just about appreciating Ontario's agricultural achievements. At the end of the day, this wine tour represents something bigger than just two politicians tasting grapes. It's a snapshot of Canadian federalism in action, with all its tensions, negotiations, and polite passive aggression. It's Ford reminding everyone that provinces have power and leverage. It's Carney trying to build bridges before he even officially enters the race. And it's all happening in one of the most Ontario ways possible, over local wine, with beautiful scenery, and probably some complaints about Toronto traffic thrown in for good measure. So did Doug Ford give Mark Carney a tour of Ontario wine country or Ontario wine country? The answer is yes. Both. Simultaneously. Because that's exactly how politics works in this country. You show off your best while complaining about your worst, you're hospitable while being demanding, and you do it all with a smile and a glass of something locally produced. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the most passive-aggressive political tour in recent memory, make sure you're subscribed to Canadian Insights because we're breaking down Canadian political drama every single day. Hit that like button if you appreciate the absurdity of our politics as much as I do, and drop a comment telling me what you think Ford and Carney actually talked about between the wine tastings. My money's on healthcare transfers and the carbon tax, but maybe they just discussed grape varietals. Turn on notifications so you catch every video we drop, because with the way Canadian politics is going right now, there's always another story that's equal parts important and ridiculous. I'll catch you in the next one.